Hello and welcome everyone to this lunchtime session and chat on making economics more inclusive. My name is Danny Roderick from Harvard University, also serving currently as president of the International Economic Association. I'm joined by Ashwini Deshpande, who doesn't need much introduction, a professor at Ashoka University and a development labor economist and leading voice in gender economics and making economics a fairer, more inclusive discipline. We were also supposed to be joined and perhaps will be joined by Justin Yifulin and Leonard Wanchikon. They seem to be lost somewhere in Zoom land, and hopefully they'll find their way back to this room. The topic, as I said, is making economics more inclusive. This, of course, is a set of questions that have become more and more relevant and burning in some sense for the discipline. I think it's a great thing that the discipline is currently experiencing a soul searching about its problems of lack of diversity, lack of inclusion, how to overcome racial, ethnic, or gender imbalances in the profession. One of the aspects of diversity that I think has probably received less attention until recently is the question of sort of the global geographic diversity of the economics profession. There's a lot of talent and ideas in the world of economics outside North America and Western Europe. And being open to those ideas and those resources, those intellectual currents, I believe is extremely important for the economics discipline, not just to make the discipline more equitable or fairer, but actually to increase the quality of research, to increase the quality of academic scholarship by being open, not just to voices around the world, but those voices that reflect the diverse realities of how economic science plays out in very, very different contexts. Some of the leading ideas in economics really have come from sort of scholars traveling around the world and getting ideas about how economics works differently. Sometimes I give the example of Joe Stiglitz, who got his early ideas about information economics when he was in Africa as a young researcher, or Albert Hirschman's ideas about exit voice and loyalty that again came from his experience with traveling in Africa. But those scholars had the luxury of being able to go back to sort of northern institutions and disseminate those ideas. There are many other such ideas and important insights that don't percolate up because the scholars who come up with them don't have access to the networks, to the publications, to the conferences, to the journals that tend to publish disproportionately authors that are based in Europe and in the United States. At the International Economic Association, we've sort of taken this theme of diversifying economics globally as one of the key priorities of what we're trying to do. We've had a number of panels, online panels and videos that you can watch if you go to the International Economic Association webpage. And so we're as president of the IEA, I'm very happy that the Royal Economic Society has been partnering with us and has given us also this opportunity to air these issues in the context of this lunchtime chat. So let me not say much more by way of introduction. As I said, I'm joined currently by just by Ashwini, and so I'm going to ask her to make some comments about her thoughts on these issues, and then we will have a discussion. Ashwini, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Danny. And it's great to be here at the lunchtime chat at the Royal Economic Society conference. There are of course lots and lots of things to be said about diversity and inclusion, not all of which are point to the same direction. So actually what I'm going to say is also highlight some of the challenges inherent in achieving what we might consider a right mix of diversity and inclusion. But let me just start by first actually congratulating Danny as president of IEA for leading various initiatives for making sure that the discipline is more inclusive, more diverse, and more voices from different parts of the world and different age groups also represented. There's this IEA started this featured economist of the month, which features young economists working around the globe. And this is one example of the many ways in which we showcase the profession as actually, on the ground, it is diverse. The point is that if you picked up journals or if you picked up conference, attendees, etc., that diversity which is on the ground doesn't get reflected. So it's a great job that IEA is doing in terms of reflecting the underlying diversity in practitioners of economics. We, as a part of the IEA, some of us prepared a note on what could be done concretely to increase the gender balance within economics. And I want to present some thoughts from that note, and then go on to raise a couple of other questions, Danny, with your permission. So when we look at leadership positions within economics bodies, which is networks of professional economists or journal editorships or top conference organizers, we find underrepresentation of women in general, and not just in developing countries, everywhere. What the discipline, one welcome development in the discipline has been the explicit recognition of underrepresentation of women, and practically all major professional bodies have not only taken note of this problem, but have suggested the various ways in which greater gender equality can be fostered. And what the IEA note focused on was that in order to increase representation at the top, we have to figure out where in the pipeline or at which multiple points in the pipeline, starting from the life of an undergraduate student all the way to a top leadership position in the profession, at which points do women either drop out or are less able to get ahead? What are the structural constraints or barriers that prevent women from getting ahead at each of these points? So what the approach that we have adopted in that note was that we need to go beyond the focus on just leadership positions and identify, in fact, the whole path that students of economics take. And what is it about which part of that path that makes it harder for A, women, and B, women from developing countries to advance to the next stage? And I think the first task is to create an evidence base which will map out the structures of disadvantage or structural constraints that line this path. And what we are lacking right now is that evidence base. There are anecdotal accounts, there are studies based upon journal publications, but these are all usually US based. There's now studies on conference participation, hostility to women speakers, etc. But all of this data is coming really from developed countries. And we need to map out this larger evidence base and to figure out whether it is the point of access into the profession, whether it is the climate that might be hostile or misogynist in some way, etc. And all of these factors, I think, need to be thought about carefully and mapped out. The second point is that it's not just gender. We have to look at the intersection of gender by a variety of other factors. So I mentioned one already, which is gender and location. So if you're a woman and from a developing country, the barriers will increase that much. within countries, there are social identities that are particularly disadvantaged. So there could be racial groups, there could be caste groups, there could be religious groups. And if you are a woman from any of these intersecting identities, that makes it that much harder. And I come from India, which is a virtual laboratory of all kinds of axes of advantage and disadvantage. So we have rural-urban disparities, we have linguistic disparities, we have disparities between tribal groups and non-tribal groups, between caste groups, etc. And the intersection of gender with all of these social identities means that the challenges of achieving a gender inclusive profession are that much harder, right? But I think that what is important is, instead of getting sort of looking at the enormity of the problem and say, okay, this is something that's so big that we can't tackle, it might actually be worthwhile to think of specific aspects of this challenge and to address them at level. So for example, if you think of 4 broad stages, which is undergraduate, which is pre-doctoral, then the graduate stage, which is doctoral students, then young faculty and senior faculty. Supposing you think of these 4 milestones in the career of a professional economist, and then think of the barriers to women at each of these stages, then in fact, what we are doing is we are breaking down the problem into smaller components. And then it looks like we might be able to identify and pilot some interventions which might be different by geography, but they would be suited to these particular stages. So for example, when you think of undergraduate students, is it the case that women join, say, a university like Ashoka University, which is a liberal arts university, and don't opt for economics? I don't know that this is the case. I'm just raising it hypothetically, because they feel that the career prospects going forward are limited, or that it's too mathematical and they are less confident of their mathematical ability, or any of these factors. Now, this is something that can be worked on, because as it turns out, in India, there are many institutions where, in fact, the representation of men and women in STEM subjects is not that, the gaps are not as large. So we could provide information, we could provide bridge courses, we could provide mentoring. Now, this is something that would direct women in the first year of their undergraduate to choose economics as major. Simultaneously, we could work within the community of teachers, professors, and make them more aware to being less, clubby, or less, let's meet after class and play a game of basketball or go for a beer or something, not have interactions that will exclude women, because of just the social realities and so on. Similarly, when you come to graduate programs and so on and so forth. So you can think of a variety of interventions tailored to the specific stage of progress, of advancement within the career. And I think that would break the problem down into parts. And these interventions may not be the same in every part of the world. And this links to my earlier point about the evidence base. But if we have a good evidence base, then we can actually tailor interventions depending on where we are intervening. Should I stop here, or should I make a few more remarks, Danny? I'm happy to stop.
Why don't you go on for another 5 minutes, and then I have some questions for you.
All right.
So please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. So this actually, because I started with gender, let me introduce another element in this conversation, which is related to research and knowledge production. One of the, at least, and this I'm speaking from my experience in India. I don't know whether other countries in the world have exactly similar experiences or not, but let me put this out on the table. Because, as I mentioned earlier, India has many different axes of advantage and disadvantage and multiple social identities that individuals hold. There's a big conversation going on in India about who can speak on behalf of whom, and who should be producing knowledge about the conditions of which group. And I think that's an absolutely welcome and very thought-provoking conversation, because we don't want individuals from certain groups, advantage groups, to be the gatekeepers and to be the spokespersons on behalf of everybody. That conversation, is now talking about lived experience, let's say, of marginalized caste groups or marginalized tribal groups, and so on and so forth. And as I said before, I think it's an absolutely fabulous conversation and it must be had. And it raises some uncomfortable questions, and so be it. However, let me introduce an anecdote here which will illustrate the larger point that I'm making. I work on women, amongst other things. I work on gender gaps. I work on women's problems in India, some with reference to the international context. But I've had two students, one who's doing a PhD with me currently at Ashoka, and a student who had done his research with me earlier at the Delhi School of Economics, where I was teaching. They are both men, but they chose as their research topic the very important question of gender gaps, with a very sympathetic perspective towards women's marginalization or disparities that leave women out of the occupational space. Should I have accepted them as my students? Being men, should they have worked on these questions? My individual answer is yes, because in the question of equal rights for women, I see these individuals as allies, not as appropriators. So I don't think these students were claiming to speak on behalf of the women. I think they extended out of their comfort zones. They chose to study a group to which they themselves did not belong by birth, and produced research that I think contributes to the knowledge of our understanding of gender gaps. So while we must be very mindful of not letting established gatekeepers, privileged individuals from privileged backgrounds to continuously speak on everybody's behalf, and why we must make every effort of making any body representative and diverse, I'm always troubled by this question of, should we just shut down a stream of inquiry because it is being pursued by somebody who didn't belong or who wasn't born in the social identity on behalf of whose problems are being highlighted in the research. And so I think that taking a black and white position here, or a yes and no position, I think would be detrimental to the production of knowledge. It all depends on what is being said and with what perspective, and with the adequate level of respect or not, right? So if today my student makes a statement and I say, well, you don't know anything because you've never lived the life of a woman, but this is what it feels like, that my student should be willing to listen to those comments. But should he not be working on gender gaps? I don't think so. And so I feel very conflicted and troubled when obviously I'm a woman and I work on women's issues, so that's okay. But I would very much welcome non-women to also advance the feminist cause, for example. And similarly, I think that goes for other social identities as well. But when does this convert into gatekeepers from privileged groups, from dominant groups, being the spokespersons for everybody? So when do we cross that line? And that's the line that I think we need to be mindful of not crossing. So I think this is a delicate gray area, and I don't think we can have clear-cut policies one way or the other. But I just feel very troubled when everybody is being asked to go back into their silos and say, oh, you can only work on the group that you were born into. And I think that that makes the task of forming solidarities, or that makes the form of making bridging alliances that much harder. Anyway, let me stop here. There are a couple of other points I want to make, but let's have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Ashwini. Those are very, very useful comments, and I hope we get to the other points that you wanted to raise. I think one of the important points that you made is how we can break this broad problem into smaller, perhaps more manageable problems that are also amenable to analysis. In fact, analysis of the kind that we should be good at with the kinds of tools that economics provides. And one way of cutting that problem is to divide the profession into distinct stages. The undergraduate stage of studying economics, the doctoral stage of becoming a researcher, the junior scholar or young faculty member stage when you're trying to hone your skills and become a better researcher, and finally sort of the senior professor stage or the senior faculty member stage. And presumably, the obstacles and the kinds of questions that we want to ask at each stage in terms of what lies behind underrepresentation, whether we're talking about gender, we're talking about geography, whether we're talking about access to resources and so forth. So that's a way that we can, both split the problem into smaller, manageable problems and also study them specifically. So I thought that that's extremely useful, and understanding exactly what the choke points are in that process. When do we start losing talent in that sort of process? It would be very interesting to know more of. And as you said, this is an issue on which there has been some work in the advanced countries, but we know actually very little about in the context of developing countries. I see now that we're actually joined by Justin Yifulin, better late than never. Thanks for joining us. So since we have only about 15 minutes left in this session, and we do have to end at 15 minutes past the hour, I thought perhaps I had some questions for you, Ashwini, but I think I'll turn over now to Justin, perhaps to give us 5 minutes of his own views on this question of how to make economics more inclusive. Of course, Justin does not need much introduction. He leads the Institute for New Structural Economics at Peking University. So we're very glad to have you, Justin. So let me turn over the Zoom to you.
Well, sorry to be late because I thought the meeting will start in about 30 minutes from now, but I'm ready to have the opportunity to chat a little bit. I think the economics certainly is very important because we need to have the economics to understand the challenges and opportunities, and to have the economic theory to guide our actions. I think that should be agreed. But if you look into the inclusiveness, certainly there are two dimensions. One is how to make the economic development within a country to be inclusive. But the other one is how to make the global economy become more inclusive, and specifically how to narrow the income gap between the advanced country and the developing country. And I will talk about mostly the second part of the inclusiveness, because we have 85% of population in the developing world. They all have the dream to close the gap with the high income country. But although all the developing countries, they have these aspirations, and especially after they gained the political independence since the Second World War, from the colonial power. But the performance seems to be not so good, because so far only 2 low-income economies can move up to the high-income economies. That is South Korea, Taiwan, China, and in mainland China, maybe the 0-1 in a few years. In the 1960s, there were 101 middle-income economies in the world. By the time I became the chief economist of the World Bank in 2008, only 13 of them moved from middle income to high income. And among those 13, 8 were European countries, like Greece, Portugal, and Spain, were oil producing countries. The other 5 were Japan and 4 small East Asian tigers. And so from this performance, I think that after the Second World War, the majority of the European countries has been trapped in the low income status or middle income status. And their gap with the high income country actually continued to be widening. And it was not because the developing country, they did not work hard to pursue their dream. I think that they were guided by the theory that popular in the world. And those theory, economic theory, mostly came from the high income country, based on the experiences of the high income country. But we know that any kind of theory certainly are embedded in the country which produce the theory, and embedded in the stage of economic development and the social political structures. And if you use those kind of theory to understand the challenges and opportunities in the developing country, and guide their policies, actions, and so on, but the condition in the developing country were very different. They are at a different stage of development. They have different social political structure, and also the preconditions that in the European country were very different from the preconditions in high-income country. And so those kind of implicit condition, implicit, assumption of the prevailing theories do not exist in the developing world. And under the kind of situation, if you use the theory to explain what's the trouble or what the situation in the developing country, although you may be able to provide very convincing story, narratives, but if you to guide their policy actions, very often it fails. But in the economic communities, both in the high-income country or in the developing country, in general, we use the theory, the prevailing theory, to understand the opportunity and the challenge in the developing country. Or we use the data in the developing country to test the theory that prevail in the world. Certainly, by that we can publish articles doing well to us, but those kind of effort, will not contribute too much for the developing country to close the gap with the high-income country. And so that's the reason why I proposed the new structural economics, to say the structure in the developing countries are different from the structure in the high-income country, both in terms of industrial structure, social political structures, the structural differences. And secondly, those kind of structural differences are endogenous. There must be some reason for them to have those kind of structure. So for us, if we want to, doing well and also doing good in terms of closing the gap between the developing country and developed country to guide the policy actions in the developing country, we need to pay attention to this kind of structural differences. And if we can do that, I think we have the opportunity to help the developing country to catch up the developed country and to have an inclusive world. At this time, I think because it's only 5 minutes, so I talk about how to make it more inclusive in the world. But next time, if there's an opportunity, I'll also be happy to say how to make it more inclusive within a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. I think that's a very powerful message about the importance of structural differences and understanding well, and that's why this two-way relationship between diversity and the important quality of research that enhances our discipline. I'm very happy to see Leonard Wanchikon has joined us as well. I'll give him 5 minutes in a second. Before I do that, there are a couple of interesting questions that I want to ask. I want to quickly read out now, because I'm going to turn to Ashwini to have some thoughts or closing thoughts on those questions in the time that's left. One question is, how do you go about promoting inclusivity without reducing the problem to essentially a tick boxing kind of an exercise? that reduces the complex and multidimensional facets of an economist or a person to simply just one dimension, whether it's women, Asian, gay, etc. So that's one question, if you have any thoughts. The second, Ashwini, is about the point you made about members of privileged groups working on research about other groups. Do you have any thoughts about sort of what best practices in this domain might be? So two challenging questions, but I wanted to raise them now and give you a few minutes to think about. Well, Leonard has 5 minutes. Leonard Wanchikon is welcome, professor at Princeton. You have 5 minutes.
So yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm going to be very direct and very, very practical. Three things. So first, I think development knowledge is universal, and whatever is today is the heritage of generation of economists. Some mainstream, some not mainstream. So my view is that there should not be fundamental differences in the core economic research between the North and the South. There might be nuances, there might be specific dimensions that need to be stressed more. For instance, integrating history is maybe something that's more like important in some developing countries than developed countries because of lack of knowledge about how the past affect the present. Designing political institutions to improve policy making, it's something that might be very prevalent in developing countries because, for instance, constitutions and public management structures are work in progress. So that's the first point. The second point is that given where we are, it's really important that there is, in terms of diversity and inclusion, there need to be a serious effort, more than lip service, to get Blacks and Africans in particular to prosper in the profession. Like for instance, there are universities that have not admitted one Black student for 15 years. I think that should be illegal. That should be, that's crazy, So this is what's happening in many, many places. But at the same time, I think I think we need to really promote academic entrepreneurship. We need people who want to go beyond just publishing papers here and there, but creating opportunities, institutional opportunity for others. And if you look at Latin America, you look at Europe, you look at Asia, like some of the most advanced research centers have been initiated by someone, by a group of people. The most prominent, for instance, in physics is Professor Abdul Salam work in Pakistan. And the fact that he actually managed to set up centers in physics around the world, particularly in my home country, Benin. Maybe the best math and physics center in Africa today has been set up by a Pakistanese physicist, because he has a vision, a global vision of science and technology. So academic entrepreneurship is very, very, very critical. The way this is going to work is by getting those entrepreneurs, for us, to get universities to work with researchers, academic entrepreneurs from developing countries to establish programs, joint degree program, labs, so that we can have very direct, decentralized exchange of knowledge between Western-based universities and developing countries universities, particularly in Africa. So this is for me the future. And then the third, a point that I really would like to stress is to pay attention to details. Like for instance, the Journal of Development Economics, as far as I know, have never had an African as editorial board member. I mean, and it's not it's not because there is no highly qualified, productive Africans, So someone has to realize that this is happening and this is wrong, we in the profession, we just learn to go on with our lives, not pay attention to those kind of issues around us. So I think there need to be a mechanism to be able to find out those kinds of dysfunctions and be very quick and decisive in trying to fix them. I mean, there are many organizations like NBR and others, for instance, who have done exactly that. Like, for instance, like NBR last year have increased the number of Africans and people coming from non-top 5 universities by, is it sort of 80% or 50, because those people were there. Nobody have seen them. All of a sudden, when the problem has been raised, the assumption has been pointed to, immediately they have an action. So this is the kind of model. So to summarize 3 things, I think that there need to be effort to get economic research and knowledge from various parts of the world to fit together so that we actually learn from each other, so that we allow each of us to actually focus on specific aspects. This is the nature of research, but there shouldn't be one economic theory for some places and another for other places. That's my view. Second one is academic entrepreneurship. The need for institutions, for individuals to actively build places, whether it's lab, whether it's program, because to be able to advance quickly, this is what is needed. It cannot be once in a while, it cannot be initiated. It has to be something bold, entrepreneurial type. And the third point is the profession has to pay attention to details. There are obvious dysfunctions. We need to point to them. We need to know what they are and fix them quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard, for fitting so many important points into a relatively short space and time. Ashwini, I gave you 2 challenging questions and we have 2 minutes. So.
Let me try to quickly answer the first one about ticking boxes. I think what ticking boxes makes you aware of is the need to look beyond a network of just close friends who are most likely to be from the same demographic group as you are. So even if you had to pick a box to include a woman or a gay person or LGBTQ, you would be forced to look outside your network, to look for whether there's talent from other demographic sections. And obviously, the aim is not to lower the level of talent or lower the level of merit, but the aim is to look for merit outside of your comfort zone. And so, of course, we are not unidimensional and we don't fit into a box. Nobody does. I don't do, and you don't do either. But I think the original, till we actually change the way we think, it is important to focus on boxes. So, for example, now if you have a manel, you get called out, right? So it just means that there are women out there who can speak. But earlier, when the age of manels, you didn't bother to look because it wasn't important.
Thank you.
So that's the first. I think I won't be able to answer the second one
Well, in a future conversation, because this is something that we need to keep talking about and have to get better at. I really want to thank Ashwini, Justin, and Leonard. One interesting theme that runs across all the presentations, I think, is the tension between having sort of one economics, but also paying attention to differences in context and differences in how the questions that we ask, differences and perhaps in perceptions of what counts as quality. And I think we probably all would agree that we don't want, by paying more attention to diversity and underrepresentation, we don't want to create a balkanized economics where economics is done differently in different parts of the world. I think we want to learn from the differences in structure and conditions, but we want to have a global discipline that actually where people talk to each other, that there is a common language. So it's a universal discipline, as Leonard says, but it's paying attention to institutional and structural historical detail of different parts, as Justin has emphasized. So in the words of a title of a book that I know well, I would say it's One Economics, Many Recipes. Thank you all. We have run out of time, but it's a conversation that we need to continue and to continue to deepen. Thank you.